Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we're going to pull back the velvet curtain on a part of history that's often scrubbed clean in our minds. The truly, utterly disgusting hygiene habits of royalty. You're nestled in your clean sheets, a gentle breeze rustling through the open window, perhaps the soft hum of an air conditioner your only companion. But close your eyes and imagine the world of a king or queen in, say, the 17th century. The air, thick and cloying, doesn't smell of fresh laundry or blooming jasmine. It smells of unwashed bodies, stale wine, and something vaguely rotten that you can't quite place. You're about to experience the royal court, and I promise you, you probably wouldn't survive your first day. The stench alone would likely send you reeling. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you in the comments below. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You might think that being a king or queen meant being the pinnacle of cleanliness, a shining example of health and purity. After all, they had endless resources, servants to attend to their every whim, and a public image to uphold. But you'd be dead wrong. For much of history, especially in the European courts we're exploring tonight, bathing was not just a rare luxury, it was often considered dangerous. You see, the medical wisdom of the time, and I use that phrase very loosely, held that bathing was an invitation for disease. They believed that hot water would open your pores, allowing evil vapours and illnesses to enter your body. So, instead of a refreshing soak in a tub, you're more likely to find yourself being dry cleaned by your attendants. Imagine a servant vigorously rubbing you down with a linen cloth, maybe a bit of rose water or perfume to cut the grime, but never truly washing away the layers of dirt and sweat. It's a bit like a cat giving itself a bath, just with more expensive fabric. This was your daily routine, a brisk dry rub down to remove the most superficial layer of filth while leaving the rest to fester. This isn't just a fringe tidbit, it was mainstream medical belief. A good example is King Louis XIV of France, a man we'll be visiting quite a bit tonight. Despite his opulent palaces and lavish lifestyle, it is said he only bathed a few times in his entire life. Think about that for a second. The Sun King, the embodiment of French power and splendour, rarely, if ever, took a proper bath. And when he did, it was usually a grand ceremonial affair, not a simple act of personal hygiene. He was more likely to have a basin of scented water brought to him to wash his hands and face, but the rest of his body was left to its own devices. This was a man who lived to the ripe old age of 76, and his longevity, many believe, was a testament to his good health. But perhaps it was just a testament to his immune system's remarkable ability to withstand his own personal filth. Historians still argue whether his aversion to water was purely due to medical advice or a personal preference for a dry approach to hygiene. Either way, his infrequent bathing set the standard for his court. The result of this aversion to water was, as you can imagine, a truly overpowering bouquet. The royal personage, and by extension the entire court, carried a powerful, musky scent. This wasn't the pleasant, natural smell of a healthy human. It was the smell of accumulated sweat, unwashed hair, and old clothes. The lack of bathing also meant that personal grooming was, well, a whole different ballgame. You didn't just hop in the shower and shave. Instead, you had to deal with the constant build-up of grime and body hair in a much more hands-on way, often involving metal tools and no disinfectant. It's a miracle they didn't all die from infections. And it wasn't just the royal person themselves, their clothes, their bedding. Everything around them was perpetually a little bit grimy. The idea of washing something after a single use was utterly foreign. Now let's bring in a quirky tidbit. During this period, it was not uncommon for people, even royals, to believe that a layer of dirt and oil on the skin acted as a protective barrier against disease. So instead of being something to be removed, it was seen as a kind of natural armour. They would even use certain powders and ointments not to cleanse, but to add to this protective layer. It's a bit like putting a coat of wax on your car to protect the paint, except the car is your body and the wax is just a lot of gross stuff. This belief created a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, where the more unwashed you were, the more protected you were believed to be. Of course, this did nothing to stop the spread of disease as we know today, but in their minds it made perfect sense. You might be thinking, but didn't they have soap? Yes, they did. but it was often a harsh, lye-based substance that was incredibly drying and painful on the skin, and therefore not used for personal hygiene. It was primarily used for laundry, and even then its use was limited. The idea of a gentle, moisturising soap for your body was centuries away. So you're stuck with this dry cleaning method, a cloth and some scented water, and the constant nagging feeling of being fundamentally unclean. Your skin feels clammy and a bit rough. Your clothes cling to you in a way that's not quite right, and you can't escape the vague, sour scent of yourself. This is the reality of being a royal in this era, a life of immense power and wealth, but one where basic cleanliness was a foreign concept. The fact that they didn't bathe much is a huge mainstream historical fact that completely reframes our understanding of the past. When you see a lavish painting of a royal court, full of beautiful people in silks and satins, you have to remember that they all smelled terrible. The colours were vibrant, the music was grand, but the air was thick with the scent of unwashed bodies. It's a very different picture from the sanitised versions we often see in films, and this lack of bathing had ripple effects throughout the rest of their lives, influencing everything from their dental health to their fashion choices. The world of these royals was a sensory assault, and the dominant sense was not sight or sound, but the overwhelming, almost suffocating smell of uncleanliness. As you drift deeper into the past, you're not just a passive observer, you're an unwelcome guest at the court of King Louis XIV, and the first thing that hits you isn't the dazzling chandeliers or the gold leaf on every surface, it's the smell. It's a heavy, oppressive blanket of odour that hangs in the air, a complex and frankly revolting perfume of unwashed humanity. The sheer scale of the stench at Versailles is a legendary mainstream historical fact, so much so that it's often the first thing mentioned when discussing the hygiene of the Sun King's court. You'd expect a palace, the pinnacle of European civilization, to be a place of pristine splendour, but the reality was a sensory assault. Imagine hundreds of nobles, their servants, and the king himself all adhering to the belief that bathing was a dangerous activity. The accumulated scent of their bodies, combined with their lavish but rarely washed silk and velvet clothing, created an unforgettable miasma. You walk through the Hall of Mirrors, its immense windows reflecting the pale morning light, but the beauty is completely overshadowed by the air you have to breathe. It's a dense mixture of body odour, stale sweat, and a thick layer of perfume meant to mask the reality. The perfume, by the way, was usually applied with a heavy hand, a desperate and ultimately futile attempt to cover up what lay beneath. It's like trying to hide a dumpster fire with a single air freshener. The irony isn't lost on you. The most magnificent palace in the world was also one of the most foul-smelling. The nobles who vied for the king's attention would crowd around him, creating a hothouse of body heat and competing stenches. For them, proximity to the king was a status symbol, a sign of favour. For you, it's a reason to hold your breath and wish you had a modern-day face mask. Now, let's get into a quirky or fringe tidbit. It's said that Louis XIV's own personal body odour was so strong that his doctor, fearing the king might be poisoned, ordered him to be bled and given an enema to cleanse him from the inside out, rather than suggesting a simple bath. This belief shows how deeply ingrained the idea was that bad smells came from within, and couldn't be solved by surface cleaning. They literally thought the problem was in his guts, not on his skin. This wasn't an isolated incident, it was part of a broader medical theory of humours, where everything from your mood to your personal scent was believed to be a result of the balance of fluids inside you. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine medical belief or a convenient excuse to avoid the unpleasantness of a real bath. It was certainly easier to administer an enema than to deal with the public spectacle and supposed health risks of a full-body wash. The royal court's personal hygiene, or lack thereof, extended to every corner of the palace. There was no running water, of course, but the system for waste disposal was equally grim. Servants would use chamber pots and then empty them out of windows or into a designated latrine area, but these were often few and far between for a palace of thousands of people. The courtiers, in their haste to get to a meeting or a social function, would often simply relieve themselves in stairwells, corners, or behind tapestries. This created a truly horrific cocktail of human waste and general grime. You can almost feel the sticky, grimy floors beneath your feet as you navigate the labyrinthine corridors. The opulence and grandeur of Versailles were literally built on a foundation of filth. It's a bit like seeing a pristine white wedding cake and then finding out it's made of stale bread and old mayonnaise. The king's own habits were no better. Louis XIV, despite his fastidious attention to detail in court etiquette and fashion, was reportedly indifferent to personal cleanliness. He would only change his shirt when it was visibly soiled, and his bed linens were a source of much debate and intrigue among historians. The idea of fresh, crisp sheets every night was a modern luxury he couldn't even dream of. The bedding was often used for weeks on end, accumulating layers of sweat, dead skin, and who knows what else. The bedchamber, which should have been a sanctuary, was anything but. It was a haven for fleas, lice, and other unpleasant creatures that thrived in the unhygienic conditions. A light joke here, you could say that the king's bed was so full of life, it was practically an ecosystem. The courtiers naturally followed the king's lead. If the Sun King himself saw no need for daily bathing, why should they? They were all engaged in a constant game of one-upmanship, trying to be more fashionable, more influential, and closer to the king. But this competition didn't extend to personal hygiene. The sheer volume of people packed into the palace, all sharing the same air and the same general lack of cleanliness, made the spread of diseases and pests a foregone conclusion. The court was a petri dish of infections, and it's no wonder that plagues and fevers were a constant threat. The casual attitude towards sanitation was, to us, a death sentence waiting to happen, but to them, it was just life. The open scholarly debate here is whether this was a conscious, philosophical choice, or simply a practical reality born from the limitations of the era. Was it a choice to avoid baths due to medical beliefs? Or did the sheer logistical nightmare of providing clean water and proper sanitation for thousands of people simply make it impossible? The royal family's habits were a reflection of the wider society, but on a grander, more concentrated scale. The common people didn't fare much better, but they didn't have the vast resources of a palace to make their mess on. The royals, with their servants and their wealth, could have been a beacon of cleanliness, a shining example of how to live a healthier life. Instead, they embraced the prevailing wisdom of their time, and in doing so, created an environment that was both magnificent and deeply, fundamentally gross. The beautiful tapestries, the exquisite furniture, the priceless art, all of it was steeped in the collective odour of a court that never, ever truly washed. You can see a magnificent portrait of a beautiful duchess, her skin porcelain and her clothes impeccable, but you know in your gut that if you were to stand next to her, the smell would be overwhelming. It's a powerful reminder that history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about the lived sensory reality of people who were, in many ways, very different from us. With the lingering stench of Versailles still clinging to your imagination, let's move from the skin to the smile, or more accurately, the lack thereof. You might think that a person of royal standing, with all the power and wealth in the world, would have access to the best dental care available. The reality, however, is a gruesome and painful story of neglect and misguided remedies. For most of history, including the period we're exploring, royal dentistry was less about preservation and more about brute force extraction. The mainstream historical fact is that dental hygiene as we know it simply didn't exist. There was no toothpaste, no regular brushing, and certainly no flossing. Instead, the royal mouth was a breeding ground for decay and disease. Imagine a king sitting on his throne, his mouth a rotting cavern of black decaying teeth. It's a powerful and deeply unsettling image. The royal diet, rich in sugar, wine, and elaborate sweets, was a disaster for dental health. Sugar, a luxury item reserved almost exclusively for the wealthy, was a constant part of their meals. This diet, combined with the total absence of a cleaning routine, led to rampant tooth decay, painful abscesses, and a truly terrible smell coming from their mouths. You see, the common person often had a healthier diet, full of rough, fibrous foods that helped scrape the teeth clean. But the royals, with their refined cuisine, were essentially eating a recipe for dental disaster. You might think, but surely they could have used something to clean their teeth. Well, they did try, but their methods were less than effective. This brings us to a quirky tidbit. Some royals and their courtiers would attempt to clean their teeth by rubbing them with a rough cloth and a mixture of salt and soot. Imagine the feeling of grinding abrasive soot into your already sensitive gums and decaying teeth. It was a painful and likely damaging process that did little to combat the underlying decay. They were essentially scrubbing the surface while the rot continued from the inside out. For a brief light joke, you could say their dental routine was less a cleaning and more a very slow, very painful way of sandblasting their teeth away. This wasn't a daily ritual either, but something done occasionally, perhaps before a major public appearance, in a desperate attempt to improve their foul breath. When a tooth became too painful, the only recourse was extraction, and this was not a gentle process performed by a skilled dentist. It was often carried out by a barber surgeon, a jack-of-all-trades who handled everything from haircuts to amputations. The tools were unsterilised, and the procedure was done without any form of anaesthesia beyond a stiff drink of alcohol. Imagine the king, a man who commands nations, wincing in agony as a rusty pair of pliers is used to yank out a decaying molar. The pain would have been excruciating, the risk of infection enormous. You can almost hear the wet cracking sound as the tooth is pulled from its socket, a sound that would send shivers down your spine. This was the reality of royal dental care, a last resort, a brutal act of force to remove a problem that had been festering for years. The open scholarly debate surrounding this is whether the terrible state of royal teeth was a result of genuine ignorance or a kind of twisted status symbol. Historians still argue whether the black decaying teeth of someone like Queen Elizabeth I were just a consequence of her sweet-filled diet, or if they were also a subtle sign of her wealth and access to sugar. After all, if you could afford a diet that would rot your teeth, it meant you were rich. It's a macabre thought that a sign of health and beauty today, a bright white smile, was the opposite of what was valued in the past. To have a perfectly white smile might have even been seen as a sign of poverty, of someone who couldn't afford the very things that would destroy their teeth. This lack of dental hygiene had a profound impact on their lives. The constant pain from toothaches would have been a daily reality. The foul breath would have made any close conversation a trial, and the missing teeth would have made eating difficult and speaking a bit of a challenge. You see portraits of these people with their lips often tightly sealed, a slight knowing smile that hides a mouth full of rot and ruin. It's a different kind of beauty, one that valued pale skin and elaborate clothing over a healthy, clean appearance. The face was a canvas for makeup and powdered wigs, but the mouth was a hidden, rotting secret. The consequences weren't just cosmetic. Dental infections could easily spread, leading to a host of other health problems, including fever, sepsis, and even death. The lack of understanding about the link between oral health and overall well-being meant that a simple toothache could escalate into a life-threatening condition. The barber surgeon, with his dirty tools, might have extracted the tooth, but he was also likely introducing new bacteria into the wound, setting the stage for a new and more dangerous infection. It's a vicious cycle of pain and poor choices, a reality that the royals lived with every single day. You might be thinking, but didn't they try to make their breath better? Yes, they did. They would chew on herbs like parsley or mint and use scented water to rinse their mouths. But these were all superficial fixes, a futile attempt to mask a problem that was fundamentally internal. The decay was still there, the infections were still festering, and the root cause, the lack of basic cleaning and a poor diet, was never addressed. It's a bit like putting a fresh coat of paint on a rotting piece of wood. It might look better for a little while, but the decay is still happening underneath. This was the world of royal dental care, a horrifying blend of pain, decay, and ignorance, where the only solution to a problem was to physically remove it in the most brutal way possible. After witnessing the royal smile, or the lack thereof, let's turn our attention to the plumbing, or again, the lack thereof. You're still a silent observer in this grand but grimy palace, and you've probably noticed that the most pressing question of all hasn't been answered. Where did everyone go to the bathroom? The mainstream historical fact is that personal chamber pots and designated latrine areas were the primary means of waste disposal, creating a truly foul and unsanitary environment. The sheer volume of people, royals, nobles, servants and hangers-on, all living within the palace walls meant that human waste was a constant and often visible presence. You might imagine a majestic king or queen using a gilded porcelain toilet in a private bathroom. The reality is far less glamorous. The chamber pot, a simple bowl or bucket, was your constant companion. It would be placed in a private corner of your bedchamber, or perhaps even in a public hallway for convenience. This isn't a quick modern-day trip to the restroom. It's a very public, very smelly affair. The contents of these pots were then carried by servants to designated areas to be emptied. The system, or lack of one, was an open invitation for disease and a powerful source of the stench we discussed earlier. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this era is the existence of the groom of the stool. This wasn't some kind of royal barber. No, this was one of the most powerful and sought-after positions in the royal court. The groom of the stool was the king's personal attendant for the most intimate of bodily functions. Their job was to assist the monarch with their toileting needs, including carrying the chamber pot, providing clean linen, and even wiping the royal posterior. This position granted unparalleled access to the king, allowing the groom to influence decisions and gain immense political power. It's a striking example of how a role we'd find utterly disgusting today was, in its time, a position of extreme prestige. For a little joke, you could say it was the ultimate cushy job, so to speak. The process of emptying the chamber pots was often a haphazard and disgusting spectacle. Servants would simply carry them through the public corridors, a constant risk of spills and a source of pervasive odour. The designated latrine areas were often just open pits or poorly constructed trenches, located either in the palace grounds or in specific wings of the building. These areas were rarely, if ever, properly cleaned or maintained, creating a breeding ground for flies, vermin and disease-causing bacteria. The waste would simply pile up, creating a literal mountain of filth. You can almost feel the flies buzzing around your face, a constant irritating reminder of the unsanitary conditions. Historians still argue whether the royal court's tolerance for this filth was due to a genuine lack of understanding about sanitation, or a practical resignation to the realities of the time. The sheer scale of the waste produced by thousands of people living in one building would have been a logistical nightmare to manage with the technology of the era. Was it ignorance, or was it a form of forced pragmatism? This open, scholarly debate gets to the heart of how we view our ancestors. Were they just fundamentally dirtier people, or were they doing the best they could with the limited knowledge and technology they had? This widespread practice of using chamber pots and poorly maintained latrines had a direct impact on the health of everyone in the palace. The waste, containing all sorts of pathogens, would seep into the groundwater, contaminating the drinking water supply. Diseases like dysentery, typhoid and cholera were common, and they would sweep through the court with devastating speed. The very source of life, water, was also the source of death. A cruel irony that they were completely unaware of. The lack of proper sewage systems meant that the waste was always a part of their environment, not something that was neatly whisked away by modern pipes. Imagine you're a young noble, fresh from the countryside, arriving at court with a romantic vision of royal life. You're walking down a beautiful frescoed hallway, and you suddenly have to step over a puddle of human waste. The illusion of grandeur is instantly shattered. This was the constant reality of life at court. The beauty and the filth were inextricably linked, a powerful juxtaposition that defined the era. The royal person themselves, as we've established, were no cleaner than anyone else. They were just as susceptible to the diseases and the discomfort caused by this lack of sanitation. The chamber pot was the great equalizer. Everyone, from the lowliest servant to the most powerful king, had to use one. The sheer volume of waste was a problem that no amount of royal decree could solve. Louis XIV, in his wisdom, attempted to address the issue at Versailles by building a primitive system of latrines and a canal to carry the waste away, but it was a half-hearted attempt at best. The system was insufficient for the number of people, and the old habits of using chamber pots and hallways persisted. The problem was too big, and the understanding of its cause was too limited. The filth was a fundamental part of the palace's existence, as integral to its identity as the crown jewels or the royal throne. And so you're left to contemplate this reality, a world of immense power, wealth, and artistic achievement, all built on a foundation of bodily fluids and human waste. The grandeur was a thin veneer over a very dirty reality. You can't unsee it, and you can't unsmell it. The image of the king on his throne, dressed in fine silks and satins, is now permanently altered by the knowledge that just a few feet away, a servant is carrying a bucket of his waste on his way to an open pit in the grounds. It's a powerful and deeply humbling reminder of how far we've come in the simple but profound act of keeping ourselves and our world clean. Having navigated the grim reality of royal toilets, let's turn our gaze to the royal face, a canvas that, you might assume, was a picture of natural, unblemished beauty. But you'd be wrong. The mainstream historical fact is that the makeup used by royals was often made of dangerous lead-based concoctions that caused severe health problems and even death. In an era before a genuine understanding of chemistry and toxicology, the pursuit of beauty was literally a killer. The ideal of beauty for both men and women in the royal courts of the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries was a ghostly pale complexion, a look that signified you were wealthy enough to not have to work in the sun. This pallor was achieved using a substance called Venetian cerus, a mix of white lead and vinegar. Imagine you're a young courtier, looking to catch the eye of the king or queen. You apply a thick white paste to your face, neck and décolletage. The paste, made of lead, gives you that coveted, deathly pale look. It's heavy, it cracks easily, and it requires constant touch-ups, but it's the height of fashion. You might also add a touch of rouge to your cheeks and lips, a vivid red colour that was often made from cinnabar, a substance containing mercury sulfide. So your beautiful face is essentially a layer of two highly toxic heavy metals. It's a truly chilling thought, the idea that the very tools of beauty were also the tools of your slow and painful demise. This brings us to a quirky, or fringe tidbit. It's said that some women in the court of Queen Elizabeth I would even paint visible blue veins on their skin with a pencil, to enhance their translucent, pale appearance, a look meant to convey a kind of ethereal fragility. They weren't just painting their faces white, they were attempting to create an entire visual story of delicate porcelain-like skin. It's a macabre form of artistry, where the canvas is your own body and the paint is slowly poisoning you. The constant use of lead-based makeup led to a host of health issues, including skin discoloration, hair loss, and even neurological damage. The lead would slowly absorb into the skin, causing a kind of slow-motion poisoning. Your beautiful pale skin would eventually turn grey and wrinkled, and you would be forced to apply even more makeup to cover the damage, starting a vicious and ultimately fatal cycle. For a little joke, you could say their beauty regimen was less a routine and more a countdown timer. The scholarly debate still open for discussion is whether the royals and their courtiers were truly unaware of the dangers of their cosmetics, or if they simply accepted the risks as a necessary part of maintaining their status and appearance. Historians still argue whether they were genuinely ignorant of the toxic nature of lead and mercury, or if they just viewed the skin damage and health problems as a price they were willing to pay for beauty. The historical fact is that these same substances were known to be toxic in other contexts, so it's likely a mix of denial and a willingness to suffer for the sake of appearance. The social pressure to conform to the beauty standards of the day was so immense that it outweighed any health concerns. The men of the court were not immune to this trend. They too would powder their faces, often with the same lead-based products, to achieve a pale complexion. It was a unisex beauty standard that had little to do with natural health and everything to do with social status. The royal person's face, a symbol of their power, was also a symbol of their slow, self-inflicted decay. The same king who never bathed, and who had rotting teeth, was also slowly poisoning his skin for the sake of appearances. It's a powerful image of vanity and ignorance, a reminder that the past was not always a simpler time. The process of removing this makeup was also a problem. There were no gentle cleansers or makeup removers. They would often use a variety of harsh substances, including milk, lye soap, or even animal fats, all of which did little to remove the lead particles and only further irritated and damaged the skin. The lack of proper cleaning meant that the makeup would often be left on for days, allowing the toxins to be absorbed even more deeply. It's a stark contrast to our modern world, where we have a whole industry dedicated to safe and gentle cosmetics. The consequences of this vanity were not just skin deep. Lead poisoning can cause a wide range of symptoms, including kidney failure, nervous system damage, and cognitive decline. The very rulers who were making decisions for their nations were often suffering from the slow, debilitating effects of lead poisoning. It's a sobering thought that the history of Europe might have been influenced by the toxic beauty regimens of its leaders. The erratic behaviour, the fits of madness, the chronic illnesses, all of these could have been in part a result of their dangerous cosmetics. The use of these deadly cosmetics was a mainstream historical fact, a widely accepted practice that defined an era. The beautiful portraits we see in museums, with their ghostly pale subjects and vivid red lips, are a testament to this poisonous trend. But behind that beautiful facade is a reality of pain, disease, and slow-motion decay. The royal face, meant to be a symbol of divine right and perfect beauty, was actually a ticking time bomb of lead and mercury. It's a powerful reminder that history is often more complex and more terrifying than it appears on the surface. As you recoil from the ghastly reality of royal cosmetics, let's look at another royal accoutrement that was just as much a necessity as it was a fashion statement: the wig. The mainstream historical fact is that the extravagant wigs worn by royalty and their courtiers were not merely a style choice, they were a practical solution to a widespread hygiene problem. You see, the lack of bathing and the constant filth meant that lice and other parasites were an ever-present menace. The beautiful powdered periwigs that we see in portraits were, in many ways, a cover-up for a very dirty secret. Imagine the discomfort of having your own hair, unwashed for weeks or months, becoming a veritable habitat for head lice. The itching would have been maddening, a constant low-level torture that no amount of scratching could truly alleviate. But instead of cutting your hair and washing it, the solution was often to shave your head entirely and wear a wig. This was seen as a much more fashionable and socially acceptable way of dealing with the problem. The wig, in a sense, was a reset button, a clean slate that could be taken off and deloused, while your natural hair was allowed to grow back in relative peace. This brings us to a quirky or fringe tidbit. It is said that some royals would even have special sticks, often made of ivory or silver, specifically for scratching their scalp beneath their heavy wigs. These louse scratchers, as they were sometimes called, were a necessary tool of the trade for anyone who wore a wig. It's a powerful image. The king, a man of immense power, sitting on his throne, subtly scratching at his head with a fancy stick. It's a quiet, private moment of desperation that completely undermines the public image of power and grace. For a light joke, you could say the periwig was the original hat hair, but with a lot more company. The process of delousing the wigs themselves was a job for the servants. The wigs would be boiled in water, combed vigorously to remove the lice and nits, and then repowdered and styled. This was a constant, ongoing battle. The wigs were not a one-and-done solution. They too would become infested, requiring regular cleaning. It was a never-ending cycle of infestation, delousing, and reinfestation. The lack of bathing and general hygiene meant that the source of the problem was never truly addressed. The wigs were a band-aid on a gushing wound. The scholarly debate still open for discussion is whether the elaborate styles and powdered nature of the wigs were a direct result of the louse problem, or if it was a confluence of factors. Historians still argue whether the wigs became a fashion statement because they were a practical solution to lice, or if the fashion for large wigs was already in place, and the louse problem simply provided a convenient excuse to wear them. It's a classic chicken and egg situation, where the practical and the fashionable are so intertwined that it's difficult to separate them. Either way, the louse-infested reality of royal hair care is a grim mainstream historical fact that we can't ignore. The powdered nature of the wigs also served a purpose beyond just style. The powder, often made of flour or starch, would help to absorb some of the grease and grime that built up in the hair, and it also acted as a kind of dry shampoo. It helped to mask the smell of unwashed hair and bodies, adding another layer to the olfactory assault of the royal court. The powder wasn't just a cosmetic choice. It was a desperate attempt to combat the consequences of poor hygiene. The image of a beautiful powdered wig is now completely recontextualized by the knowledge that it was likely covering a shaved, itching scalp, and was constantly being used to mask a foul smell. The wigs were also incredibly expensive and difficult to maintain. They were often made from human hair, and they required a team of skilled wig makers and servants to keep them in good condition. The cost and effort that went into these wigs is a testament to how important they were, both as a status symbol and as a practical solution to a pervasive problem. The lack of hygiene, in a strange way, created a new industry and a new form of artistry. The human hair, a source of filth and lice, was transformed into a beautiful powdered work of art, a symbol of wealth and power that completely hid the disgusting reality beneath. This fashion for wigs and the shaving of a natural hair had a profound impact on the culture of the court. The wigs became a part of a person's identity, a public face that was often more important than their actual appearance. The elaborate styles, the intricate braids and curls, all of it was a performance, a deliberate act of concealing the messy, unhygienic reality of their lives. It's a powerful reminder that history is often a story of appearances and deceptions, where the beautiful and the powerful are not always what they seem. The royal head, a symbol of the divine right to rule, was also a source of endless itching and discomfort, a microcosm of the contradictions that defined the era. And so, you're left to contemplate the beautiful portraits of the past, with their elaborate wigs and powdered faces. But now you see them not as symbols of grace and beauty, but as a kind of armour, a shield against the reality of a world that was fundamentally dirty and unhygienic. The wig, an emblem of style and power, was also a silent witness to a constant secret battle against lice and filth. It's a small detail that completely changes our understanding of the royal court, transforming a world of elegance and glamour into a world of hidden discomfort and constant struggle. Now that we've delved into the royal hair and makeup, let's explore one of the most intimate and public aspects of court life, the act of going to the toilet. This might sound like a private affair, but the mainstream historical fact is that for many royals, the toilet was a surprisingly public and social event. You might imagine a king or queen in a moment of solitary reflection, but the reality was often a crowded room of courtiers vying for attention. The chamber pot, a humble vessel we've already met, was at the centre of this bizarre social ritual. Imagine you're a high-ranking noble at the court of King Louis XIV. The king is holding court, but not from his throne. Instead, he's sitting on a special commode chair, often upholstered in rich fabrics, a chamber pot discreetly placed beneath him. You and your fellow courtiers are all gathered around, standing respectfully, while the king conducts business, receives petitions, or simply socialises. This wasn't seen as a gross or undignified act. It was a sign of immense power and informality. To be in the room, to be in such close proximity to the king during this private moment, was a mark of supreme favour. The king, in a sense, was holding court from his commode. This brings us to a quirky or fringe tidbit. It is said that at Versailles, the very act of handing the king a chamber pot was a role of significant honour, reserved for only the most trusted and highest-ranking courtiers. This was a position known as the porte-chaise, or chair carrier, and it was a role that granted unparalleled access to the king's ear. The sheer physical intimacy of the role gave these individuals a chance to whisper advice, gossip, or please, without the usual formalities of court life. It's a powerful illustration of how the boundaries between public and private were completely different in the past. The toilet was a place of political manoeuvring and social jockeying, a far cry from the solitary and sterile bathroom we know today. For a light joke, you could say that the court's hierarchy was determined not by who was closest to the throne, but who was closest to the porcelain. The scholarly debate, still open for discussion, is whether this public toileting was a genuine expression of intimacy and power, or a calculated performance. Historians still argue whether the king was simply being pragmatic, using every available moment to conduct business, or if he was deliberately creating a ritual of power where he could demonstrate his absolute authority by forcing his courtiers to watch him in his most vulnerable state. It's a fascinating question that gets to the heart of how power was performed and perceived in the past. Was it a sign of trust or a demonstration of control? The sheer spectacle of it all would have been bewildering to a modern observer. The air, already thick with the various scents of the unwashed court, would have been punctuated by the sounds and smells of the king using his chamber pot. The courtiers, in their silks and satins, would have been standing a few feet away, their faces a mask of respectful deference. It was a sensory assault on multiple levels, a powerful and constant reminder of the physical realities of royal life. The grandeur and the squalor were inextricably linked, a constant juxtaposition that defined the era. This public display of bodily function also had a social component. When a member of the royal family was giving birth, for example, it was a public event, with members of the court and even the public invited to witness the birth. The idea was to ensure the legitimacy of the heir, but it was also a sign that the royal body was a public body, a thing of spectacle and ceremony. The same logic applied to their toileting. Their bodies were not their own. They were a part of the performance of power, a living symbol of the state. The lack of privacy also extended to other bodily functions. Medical procedures, for example, were often performed in public, with courtiers and servants in attendance. The royal body was a kind of open book, and every function, every ailment, every detail was a matter of public record and intense scrutiny. The idea of personal privacy, as we understand it today, was a luxury that simply did not exist for the royal family. Their lives were a constant performance, and every bodily function from birth to death was a part of that show. The irony, of course, is that for all this public display the sanitation was still terrible. The chamber pot was still a source of filth and disease, and the public nature of its use did nothing to alleviate the underlying hygiene problems. The waste was still emptied into the same open pits and latrines, and the air was still thick with the same foul smells. The ritual of the public toilet was a social solution to a logistical problem, a way of managing power and influence in a world without privacy, but it did nothing to solve the underlying health risks. And so, you're left with this final bizarre image. The king, a man who commands nations sitting on his commode surrounded by fawning courtiers. It's a powerful and slightly humorous image that completely reframes our understanding of royal life. The throne was not the only seat of power. The commode was, in its own way, just as important. The privacy we take for granted was a foreign concept, and the most intimate of bodily functions were a part of a grand public performance. The royal body was a living symbol of power and ceremony, and even its most basic functions were a part of that performance. It's a powerful reminder that history is often stranger and more disgusting than we can possibly imagine. After enduring the public spectacle of the royal toilet, let's explore how the court managed to survive the constant assault on their senses. The mainstream historical fact is that perfume was not a luxury for these royals, but an absolute necessity. It was used to mask body odour, not to enhance a natural scent. In a world where bathing was rare and a powerful musky scent was the norm, perfume was the only line of defence against a truly overwhelming bouquet. Imagine walking through the crowded halls of a palace, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale food and human waste. Your only respite is the scent you carry yourself, a thick cloying cloud of perfume that acts as a kind of personal force field. Both men and women would douse themselves in these fragrances, often applying them to their clothes, wigs and even their bed linens. It was a constant, desperate battle to cover up the underlying filth. The perfume wasn't just a part of their fashion, it was a part of their survival. This brings us to a quirky or fringe tidbit. It is said that some courtiers, particularly during the time of King Louis XIV, would carry small scented pouches called pomanders. These were often beautifully crafted spheres of silver or gold, filled with spices, herbs and other fragrant materials. You would hold the pomander to your nose to ward off the foul smells of the court. It was a portable air freshener, a personal sanctuary of good smells in a world of bad ones. It's a powerful image. The king, a man who commanded nations, sitting on his throne, surrounded by courtiers, all holding little scented balls to their noses. For a light joke, you could say they had a different kind of social distancing back then, a nose-based one. The perfumes themselves were very different from the ones we use today. They were often heavy, musky, and made from a variety of natural ingredients, including civet and musk from animals, as well as a variety of floral and herbal essences. These were not light, airy fragrances. They were dense and powerful, meant to cut through the heavy air and create a personal bubble of scent. The perfume industry, in a strange way, was a direct result of the lack of hygiene. If everyone had bathed regularly, there would have been no need for such powerful and pervasive fragrances. The business of perfume was, in a sense, the business of masking the disgusting realities of the past. The scholarly debate still open for discussion is whether the heavy use of perfume was also a sign of a person's social status. Historians still argue whether the most fragrant people were seen as the most refined, or if it was simply a practical choice for everyone who wanted to avoid the stench of the court. The cost of these perfumes, made from rare and imported ingredients, would have been prohibitive for most people, so it's likely a mix of both. The most expensive perfumes would have been a status symbol, a way of saying, I am so wealthy that I can afford to smell good, even though I haven't bathed in a month. The act of applying perfume was also a ritual in itself. It was often done in front of a mirror, with an attendant or a servant to help with the application. The perfume would be dabbed on the pulse points, the neck, and the wrists, but also on the clothes, the wigs, and the linen. It was a total sensory experience, a way of enveloping yourself in a cloud of scent that was meant to be both a pleasure and a shield. The perfume wasn't just for you, it was for everyone around you, a kind of olfactory offering to the court. The irony, of course, is that the perfume itself was often layered on top of the body odour, creating a strange and sometimes nauseating mixture of scents. It was a bouquet of unwashed body and exotic flowers, a fragrance that was both beautiful and fundamentally false. The perfume was a lie, a beautiful deception that hid a very dirty truth. You could see a beautiful duchess, her face powdered with lead and her hair in an elaborate wig, and you would smell a beautiful floral scent. But you would know, deep down, that the scent was not hers. It was a manufactured lie, a desperate attempt to create an illusion of cleanliness. This culture of perfume and odour masking had a profound impact on the senses of the people in the court. Their sense of smell would have been constantly assaulted, and it's likely they developed a high tolerance for bad smells. What we would find utterly repulsive, they would have found to be a normal part of life. The very air they breathed was a complex cocktail of smells, and they were all in their own way a part of it. The perfume was not an escape from this reality. It was an active and conscious engagement with it. And so, you're left to contemplate this final powerful image, the royal court, a place of immense power and beauty, but also a place of overwhelming filth and odour. The perfume, a symbol of luxury and refinement, was also a symbol of a deep and fundamental lack of cleanliness. The beautiful, fragrant world they created for themselves was just a thin veneer over a very dirty reality. The perfume wasn't a choice, it was a necessity, a vital tool in the constant battle against the disgusting realities of their lives. It's a reminder that history is often a story of contradictions, where the most beautiful and luxurious things are often born from the most base and unhygienic realities. We've covered the stench, the makeup, and the wigs. Now let's explore a more internal source of royal discomfort: their stomachs. The mainstream historical fact is that food poisoning was a common and gross royal ailment, a constant threat born from a lack of refrigeration, questionable food preparation, and a diet of rich, heavy foods. You might think a king or queen would have the safest food imaginable, but the reality was a constant gamble with their health. Imagine a lavish banquet hall groaning with tables piled high with roasted meats, elaborate pastries, and exotic fruits. The food, a testament to the kingdom's wealth, has been prepared for hours, if not days, and has been sitting out for just as long. There's no refrigeration, no modern sanitation in the kitchen. The cooks, with their unwashed hands, are preparing food that will be eaten by the most powerful people in the land. The leftovers from one meal are often served again at the next, a practice that, in a world without proper storage, was a recipe for disaster. The royal diet was a culinary tightrope walk, and many a royal belly suffered for it. This brings us to a quirky or fringe tidbit. It is said that some royals would employ a food taster, a person whose job it was to sample every dish before it was served to the monarch. While this was primarily a precaution against poisoning by assassins, it also served a secondary and likely unintentional purpose. It acted as a kind of early warning system for food that was simply spoiled. If the taster got sick, the king knew to avoid that dish. It's a macabre form of quality control, where the health of a servant was a tool to protect the health of the royal. For a light joke, you could say that being a royal food taster was the original taste test job, but with much higher stakes. The scholarly debate still open for discussion is whether the prevalence of royal illnesses, particularly stomach ailments, was a direct result of food poisoning, or if it was also a consequence of their rich, over-the-top diets. Historians still argue whether their frequent bouts of stomach aches, diarrhoea and vomiting were caused by bacteria in their food, or by the sheer volume and richness of what they ate. It's likely a combination of both. The diet of the elite was often heavy in fats, sugars and spices, all of which could be hard on the digestive system. The lack of fresh vegetables and fibrous foods, combined with the unsanitary preparation, was a perfect storm for a royal stomachache. The consequences of this were not just a simple upset stomach. Food poisoning in the pre-antibiotic era could be fatal. A bad piece of meat could lead to a severe bacterial infection, a fever, and a quick, painful death. The royal body, already a fragile thing, was constantly being challenged by the very food that was meant to sustain it. The royal physician, with his limited knowledge, and even more limited tools, would often attribute these illnesses to a bad humour or a weak constitution, never making the connection between the spoiled food and the royal's pain. The royal kitchen, a place that should have been a bastion of cleanliness, was often a hotbed of filth. The lack of proper washing facilities for both the cooks and the food, combined with the presence of vermin and pests, meant that bacteria was a constant presence. The very act of preparing a royal meal was an exercise in risk management, a constant battle against spoilage and contamination. The food, a symbol of wealth and power, was also a symbol of a deep and fundamental ignorance about health and sanitation. The meals themselves were often a source of great social and political importance. The seating at the table, the order in which the food was served, the conversations that took place, all of it was a part of the grand performance of court life. But beneath this glittering facade was a very real threat of illness. The beautiful food, a feast for the eyes, was often a source of pain for the stomach. It's a powerful reminder that history is often a story of contradictions, where the most beautiful things are often hiding the most dangerous truths. And so you're left to contemplate this final, powerful image, the king, a man who commands nations, sitting at a magnificent banquet table, surrounded by his courtiers. The food, a testament to his power and wealth, is piled high on the table. But every bite is a gamble, every dish a potential source of a slow, painful death. The royal banquet was a feast for the eyes, but a potential disaster for the body. It's a reminder that even the most powerful people in history were not immune to the simple, disgusting realities of their time, and that the greatest threat to a king's life might not have been a political rival, but a spoiled piece of meat. After that stomach-churning feast, let's turn our attention to the royal wardrobe, a topic of immense importance and, as it turns out, immense filth. The mainstream historical fact is that royal laundry was often handled without soap or hot water, making it a superficial and largely ineffective process. The beautiful silks, velvets and linens of the royal court were not as clean as they looked. They were often just aired out, beaten to remove dust and lightly scented to mask the lingering grime. Imagine you are a royal servant tasked with the care of the king's clothes. You don't have a modern washing machine or even a simple tub with hot soapy water. Your primary tools are a beating stick, a clothesline, and a bit of scented water. You would take the king's shirt, which he's been wearing for days, and hang it out in the sun and air. You'd beat it to get rid of the dust and any stray insects, and then you'd sprinkle it with a bit of rose water or perfume. This was the extent of the cleaning process. The grime, sweat, and body oils would remain, building up in the fabric over time, creating a powerful, unseen layer of filth. This brings us to a quirky or fringe tidbit. It's said that some royals, in an attempt to clean their clothes, would bury them in the ground for a few days, believing that the earth would somehow absorb the filth and purify the fabric. It was a bizarre and unscientific method, a kind of hope-based cleaning that did little to combat the underlying problem. It's a powerful illustration of the deep misunderstanding of sanitation and hygiene in the era. For a light joke, you could say that for them, going green meant something entirely different. The scholarly debate still open for discussion is whether this lack of proper laundry was due to a genuine lack of knowledge or a practical reality of the time. Historians still argue whether they simply didn't understand the need for hot water and soap to kill bacteria, or if the sheer logistics of heating enough water to wash thousands of pieces of clothing for a court of thousands of people made proper laundry a logistical impossibility. It was likely a mix of both. The cost of firewood to heat that much water would have been immense, and the process would have been incredibly labour-intensive. So, they settled for a much simpler and much less effective solution. The consequences of this were not just a matter of a slightly grimy shirt. The clothes themselves were a source of disease and pests. The accumulated sweat and body oils in the fabric were a perfect breeding ground for bacteria and odours. The unwashed clothes were also a haven for fleas and lice, which would jump from the clothing to the wearer and then to the next person they came into contact with. The royal wardrobe, a symbol of wealth and power, was also a vector for disease. The beautiful clothes were a dangerous trap, a constant source of discomfort and illness. The royal linens, including the bedsheets and tablecloths, were also subject to this same lack of cleaning. The bedsheets would be used for weeks on end, accumulating layers of filth, dead skin, and sweat. The tablecloths, stained with food and wine, would be used for days, simply shaken out and reused. The idea of fresh, clean linens was a luxury that was almost unheard of. The royal bedchamber, a place of supposed rest and relaxation, was actually a hotbed of germs and filth, a constant source of low-level illness and discomfort. This lack of proper laundry had a profound impact on the senses of the people in the court. The air was not just thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, it was also thick with the smell of unwashed clothes. The perfume, a desperate attempt to mask the body odour, was also a desperate attempt to mask the odour of the clothes. The sensory assault was relentless, and the lack of proper cleaning was a constant underlying source of a deep and fundamental dirtiness. The beautiful sparkling image of the royal court is now completely recontextualised by the knowledge that the clothes they were wearing were, in a very real sense, filthy, and so you're left to contemplate this final, powerful image, the king, dressed in his finest silks and satins, a symbol of immense power and wealth. But beneath the beautiful fabric, the clothes are stained with filth, and the air around him is thick with the scent of unwashed fabric and accumulated grime. The royal wardrobe, a source of pride and a symbol of power, was also a source of filth and disease, a constant reminder that even the most powerful people in history were not immune to the simple, disgusting realities of their time. The lack of proper laundry was not just a matter of personal comfort, it was a matter of life and death, and it's a powerful reminder of how far we've come in the simple but profound act of keeping ourselves and our world clean. After exploring the filth of the royal wardrobe, let's turn our attention to the silent, invisible killers that stalked the court: diseases. The mainstream historical fact is that diseases spread with terrifying ease due to the unsanitary medical practices of the time. The very people tasked with healing the royals were, in many ways, just as likely to be spreading the sickness. You might think a king or queen would have the best medical care available, but in an era before germ theory, the reality was a constant cycle of ignorance and contamination. Imagine a royal physician, a man of learning and prestige, standing over a sick monarch. He's dressed in his finest clothes, a powdered wig on his head, but his hands are unwashed, his tools are unsterilised, and his understanding of disease is based on ancient theories of bad humours and evil vapours. He might use a lancet to bleed the monarch, a common practice believed to balance the body's fluids. The lancet, however, has been used on countless other patients and has never been properly cleaned. It's a perfect vector for disease, and the very act of trying to heal the king is actually making him sicker. The royal body, already weakened by a lack of hygiene and a poor diet, is now being directly exposed to a host of new pathogens. This brings us to a quirky or fringe tidbit. It is said that some royal physicians would even use a process called cupping, where heated glass cups would be placed on the skin to create a vacuum, drawing blood to the surface. The cups were rarely, if ever, sterilised, and the process could easily lead to skin infections and other complications. It was a brutal and often ineffective practice, a kind of faith-based medicine that did little to heal the patient and a lot to cause them discomfort. For a light joke, you could say their medical procedures were less about healing and more about hoping. The scholarly debate still open for discussion is whether the royal physicians' unsanitary practices were a result of genuine ignorance, or if they were a kind of calculated performance to maintain their authority. Historians still argue whether they simply didn't know about the existence of germs, or if the ritual of their elaborate but unhygienic procedures was a way of reinforcing their power and mystique. The fact is, the medical community of the time was deeply resistant to new ideas, and the ancient theories of Hippocrates and Galen were still the dominant paradigm. The idea of tiny invisible creatures causing disease was seen as a kind of madness. The consequences of this were dire. Plagues and epidemics would sweep through the court with devastating speed, often starting in the royal family itself. The close proximity of the courtiers, the lack of sanitation, and the unsanitary medical practices created a perfect storm for the spread of disease. A simple cold could escalate into a deadly fever, and a minor cut could turn into a life-threatening infection. The royal person, a symbol of power and divine right, was in reality a fragile, vulnerable creature, constantly under attack from a host of invisible enemies. The royal nursery, a place that should have been a haven of cleanliness, was often a source of immense danger. The wet nurses, with their own set of hygiene issues, would often breastfeed the royal children, and the lack of proper cleaning for the children's clothes and bedding meant that infections were a constant threat. Child mortality was incredibly high, even for royals, and the lack of sanitation in the nursery was a major contributing factor. The royal child, a symbol of the future of the dynasty, was in reality just as likely to die from a simple infection as a commoner. The lack of understanding about disease and sanitation had a profound impact on every aspect of royal life. Funerals and death rituals, for example, were often public events, with the courtiers and the public invited to view the body. This, of course, was another opportunity for the spread of disease, as the mourners, often in a state of high emotion and close proximity, would be exposed to any pathogens the deceased might have been carrying. The very rituals of life and death were, in a strange and terrible way, also rituals of disease and contagion, and so you're left to contemplate this final powerful image, the king, a man of immense power, lying in his bed sick with a fever. The royal physician, a man of learning and prestige, stands over him, his unwashed hands and unsterilized tools a greater threat than any political rival. The royal court, a symbol of wealth and power, is in reality a hotbed of disease and contagion, and the king's greatest enemy is not another monarch, but a tiny invisible germ. It's a powerful reminder that history is often a story of hidden dangers, where the most beautiful and powerful things are also the most fragile. The lack of proper medical sanitation was not just a matter of personal discomfort, it was a matter of life and death, and it's a powerful reminder of how far we've come in the simple but profound act of keeping ourselves and our world clean. As the royal physician's unwashed hands recede from view, let's explore the one act of hygiene that we've so far only touched upon, the royal bath. The mainstream historical fact is that the royal bath was a superficial and rare event, often a ceremonial and social affair rather than a genuine attempt at cleanliness. You might imagine a king or queen soaking in a pristine tub, but the reality was a far cry from this image. Imagine a large, ornate tub being brought into the royal bedchamber. It's often made of wood, lined with cloth and filled with water that's been carried in by servants. This water is not fresh and hot. It's often a mixture of lukewarm water and various scented herbs and flowers. The water is often reused from one person to the next, with the king bathing first and then his courtiers using the same water. The idea of a personal private bath with fresh water was a luxury that was simply unheard of. The bath was a social event, a time for conversation and business, and the act of bathing was secondary to the social function. This brings us to a quirky or fringe tidbit. It is said that some royals would even have their baths filled with milk or wine, believing that these substances had purifying and beautifying properties. This was a form of extreme luxury, a testament to their wealth, but it did little to actually clean the body. The milk or wine would simply sit on the skin, and the bath, a symbol of opulence, was still fundamentally a dirty act. It's a powerful illustration of the deep misunderstanding of hygiene and sanitation in the era. For a light joke, you could say their bath time was less a wash and more a marination. The scholarly debate still open for discussion is whether the royal aversion to bathing was a genuine medical belief or a social and cultural habit. Historians still argue whether they truly believed that water was dangerous, or if the sheer logistical nightmare of providing fresh water for thousands of people simply made bathing a rarity. The lack of indoor plumbing and the need to heat large quantities of water would have made a daily bath a monumental task. It was likely a mix of both. The medical beliefs provided a convenient excuse for a practice that was already logistically challenging and socially frowned upon. The consequences of this were not just a matter of a slightly grimy body. The lack of proper bathing meant that skin infections, body odour and pests were a constant problem. The body, a canvas of filth and grime, was a breeding ground for bacteria and odours. The beautiful clothes, the elaborate wigs, the heavy perfumes, all of it was an elaborate and ultimately futile attempt to conceal a fundamental lack of cleanliness. The royal body, a symbol of power and divine right, was in reality a fragile, vulnerable creature, constantly under attack from a host of invisible enemies. The royal bath, when it did happen, was often a public spectacle. The king or queen would be attended by their servants, who would help them into the tub, scrub them, and then help them out. The bath was a part of the grand performance of court life, a ritual that was as much about power and status as it was about cleanliness. The king's body was a public body, a thing of spectacle and ceremony, and even the most intimate acts were a part of that show. The idea of personal privacy, as we understand it today, was a luxury that simply did not exist for the royal family. The irony, of course, is that the bath, a symbol of purity and cleanliness, was actually a source of disease. The reused, lukewarm water, the unwashed hands of the servants, the lack of soap, all of it meant that the bath was an opportunity for the spread of bacteria and germs. The very act of trying to get clean was actually making them dirtier. It's a powerful reminder that history is often a story of contradictions, where the most beautiful and luxurious things are often born from the most base and unhygienic realities. And so, you're left to contemplate this final, powerful image. The king, a man who commands nations, sitting in a tub of lukewarm, dirty water, surrounded by his courtiers. The bath, a symbol of immense power and wealth, is in reality a source of filth and disease, a constant reminder that even the most powerful people in history were not immune to the simple, disgusting realities of their time. The lack of proper bathing was not just a matter of personal comfort, it was a matter of life and death, and it's a powerful reminder of how far we've come in the simple but profound act of keeping ourselves and our world clean. The royal bath was a testament to their wealth and power, but it was also a testament to their ignorance and their vulnerability. It's a sobering thought that the very act of trying to get clean was a dangerous gamble with their health. As the royal bathwater cools, let's step outside the palace walls for a moment, only to find the same problems amplified. The mainstream historical fact is that animal and human waste was a constant and overwhelming presence in and around royal courts. You might imagine pristine gardens and manicured lawns, but the reality was a foul-smelling landscape of filth. This waste wasn't just a byproduct of life, it was a fundamental part of the ecosystem of the court, a constant source of odour and disease. Imagine a bustling palace courtyard. Carriages pulled by horses are constantly coming and going, leaving behind a trail of manure. The royal hounds, a beloved but unhygienic part of the court, are roaming freely, adding their own contributions to the general filth. And as we've established, the human population of the palace, lacking proper sanitation, is also adding to the problem. The waste from the chamber pots is often just dumped out of windows or into a designated pit, creating a literal mountain of filth. The ground, the air, the very atmosphere of the court was saturated with the smell of animal and human waste. This brings us to a quirky or fringe tidbit. It is said that at Versailles, the sheer volume of horse manure produced by the royal stables was so great that it was often piled up in the courtyards, creating a kind of malodorous landscape. The king, in his grandeur, would often ride through these courtyards on his way to the hunt, and the courtiers, in their silks and satins, would have to navigate this treacherous and foul-smelling terrain. It's a powerful image of the deep and fundamental contradiction of royal life, immense power and opulence, all built on a foundation of filth. For a light joke, you could say the king's court was less a garden party and more a manure mixer. The scholarly debate still open for discussion is whether this tolerance for filth was a result of a genuine lack of understanding about sanitation or a kind of practical resignation. Historians still argue whether they simply didn't know that waste was a source of disease, or if the sheer logistics of managing the waste of thousands of people and animals made it an unavoidable reality. The lack of modern sewage systems and the sheer volume of waste meant that it had to go somewhere, and the most convenient place was often just outside the door. It was a problem that no amount of royal decree could solve, a reality that they simply had to live with. The consequences of this were dire. The waste, a breeding ground for bacteria and diseases, would seep into the groundwater, contaminating the drinking water supply. Diseases like dysentery and typhoid would sweep through the court with devastating speed, often starting in the royal family itself. The very source of life, water, was also the source of death, a cruel irony that they were completely unaware of. The lack of proper sewage systems meant that the waste was always a part of their environment, not something that was neatly whisked away by modern pipes. The royal gardens, a symbol of beauty and natural order, were in reality just as filthy as the rest of the palace. The intricate hedgerows and the beautiful fountains were often a cover for the open latrines and the piles of waste that dotted the landscape. The very air you breathed, meant to be a source of refreshment and peace, was thick with the scent of waste and decay. The grandeur and the filth were inextricably linked, a powerful juxtaposition that defined the era. You could see a magnificent fountain, its water sparkling in the sun, and you would know, deep down, that the water was likely contaminated and the ground around it was saturated with filth. The royal hunt, a popular pastime for the king and his courtiers, was another source of filth. The dogs, covered in dirt and often infested with fleas, would be brought into the palace tracking in mud and waste. The dead animals from the hunt would be brought back and butchered in the courtyards, creating a bloody and unhygienic spectacle. The very rituals of royal life were, in a strange and terrible way, also rituals of filth and contamination. The beautiful sparkling image of the royal court is now completely recontextualized by the knowledge that the very ground they walked on was saturated with waste. And so you're left to contemplate this final, powerful image. The king, a man who commands nations riding through a courtyard filled with horse manure on his way to a hunt. The royal court, a symbol of immense power and wealth, is in reality a hotbed of waste and contagion, and the king's greatest enemy is not another monarch, but the very ground he walks on. It's a powerful reminder that history is often a story of hidden dangers, where the most beautiful and powerful things are also the most fragile. The lack of proper waste management was not just a matter of personal comfort, it was a matter of life and death, and it's a powerful reminder of how far we've come in the simple but profound act of keeping ourselves and our world clean. Let's now turn our attention to the royal mouth, specifically that of one of history's most iconic monarchs, Queen Elizabeth I. The mainstream historical fact is that her teeth were famously black and decaying, a direct consequence of her love for sugar and the complete lack of dental hygiene. You might picture the Virgin Queen as a paragon of beauty and health, but the reality was a gruesome and painful truth hidden behind her regal smile. Her teeth, or what was left of them, were a constant source of pain and discomfort, and a powerful visual testament to the unhygienic practices of her era. Imagine the Queen, dressed in her elaborate finery, a ruff framing her face, and her ghostly pale skin powdered with lead. When she spoke, or even laughed, she would often hold a handkerchief to her mouth, not out of modesty, but to hide the blackened stumps of her teeth. The sheer amount of sugar she consumed, a luxury item at the time, was a disaster for her dental health. She was so fond of sweets that it was said her teeth were a testament to her wealth. The more sugar you could afford, the more your teeth would rot. It was a bizarre kind of reverse status symbol, where a beautiful white smile was a sign of poverty, of someone who couldn't afford the very things that would destroy their teeth. This brings us to a quirky or fringe tidbit. It is said that when she was in her later years, her mouth was so full of decaying teeth and gum disease that she found it difficult to speak, and her attendants would have to lean in close to hear her. This was a woman who commanded a nation and spoke with authority, but her voice was often a quiet, mumbled sound due to the state of her mouth. It's a powerful and humbling image of a monarch, a symbol of immense power, being reduced to a state of quiet and pain by the simple consequences of her diet and a lack of proper hygiene. For a light joke, you could say her royal pronouncements were often more like royal mumbles. The scholarly debate still open for discussion is whether her black teeth were a source of personal shame or a matter of public indifference. Historians still argue whether she was deeply self-conscious about her teeth, or if the court simply accepted it as a part of her appearance. The portraits of her often show her with a tight-lipped smile, or with her mouth slightly ajar, never revealing the full extent of the damage. It's likely she was self-conscious, and the handkerchief was a part of a larger performance to hide her decaying smile. The court, of course, would never have dared to mention it, but it would have been an undeniable and powerful presence in every room she entered. The consequences of this were not just cosmetic. The constant pain from toothaches would have been a daily reality, a chronic source of discomfort that no amount of wealth or power could alleviate. The infections from her decaying teeth could easily spread, leading to a host of other health problems, including fever, sepsis, and even death. The lack of understanding about the link between oral health and overall well-being meant that a simple toothache could escalate into a life-threatening condition. Her royal physician, with his limited knowledge, would often attribute her ailments to a bad humour or a weak constitution, never making the connection between her rotting teeth and her physical pain. The royal diet, as we've established, was a recipe for dental disaster. But for Queen Elizabeth I, it was even more so. Her love for sugar, a symbol of her immense wealth, was also a symbol of her physical decay. The very thing that brought her pleasure was also a source of her pain. It's a powerful reminder that history is often a story of contradictions, where the most beautiful and luxurious things are often born from the most base and unhygienic realities. The royal mouth, a source of her powerful words and a symbol of her authority, was also a source of her constant pain and a powerful symbol of her physical vulnerability. The lack of dental care for the Queen also extended to the rest of the court. Her courtiers, in their attempt to emulate her, would also consume large amounts of sugar, and their teeth would suffer the same fate. The court was a place of black and decaying teeth, a gruesome and painful reality that was hidden behind a veil of pomp and circumstance. The beautiful, sparkling image of the royal court is now completely recontextualized by the knowledge that the people in it were, in a very real sense, rotting from the inside out. And so, you're left to contemplate this final, powerful image, the Queen, a woman who commanded a nation, her voice a quiet mumble, her smile a painful secret. Her teeth, a testament to her wealth and power, were also a testament to her pain and her physical vulnerability. The lack of proper dental care was not just a matter of personal comfort, it was a matter of life and death, and it's a powerful reminder of how far we've come in the simple but profound act of keeping ourselves and our world clean. The royal mouth, a source of power and authority, was also a source of filth and disease, a constant reminder that even the most powerful people in history were not immune to the simple, disgusting realities of their time. The black teeth of Queen Elizabeth I are a powerful and gruesome testament to the unhygienic realities of her era. After the gruesome reality of Queen Elizabeth I's teeth, let's pull back the curtain on the most intimate of royal spaces, the bedchamber. The mainstream historical fact is that the royal bedchamber was far from a sterile sanctuary. It was a hotbed of filth, disease and pests. You might imagine a place of pristine sheets and fresh air, but the reality was a world of unwashed linens, vermin, and a powerful cloying smell that defined the space. The royal bedchamber, a symbol of power and privacy, was in reality a petri dish of filth and a constant source of low-level illness. Imagine a large, ornate bed, draped in heavy velvet and silk curtains. The mattress, filled with straw or horsehair, is home to a host of creatures, including fleas, lice, and bedbugs. The sheets, as we've established, are rarely, if ever, washed, and they are saturated with the sweat, dead skin, and body oils of the royal person. The curtains, meant to provide privacy and warmth, are a dust trap, and the air is thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and stale perfume. The bedchamber, a place of rest and relaxation, was actually a source of constant discomfort and itching. For a light joke, you could say the royal bed was a royal menagerie of sorts, teeming with life. This brings us to a quirky or fringe tidbit. It is said that some royals would keep small, fluffy dogs in their beds, believing that the fleas and other parasites would prefer the dog's fur to their own skin. The dog, in a sense, was a kind of living, breathing flea trap, a furry sacrifice for the sake of the royal's comfort. It's a powerful and slightly humorous image, a king or queen surrounded by their attendants, with a small dog sleeping at their feet, a silent guardian against the constant threat of fleas and other pests. The scholarly debate still open for discussion is whether the lack of cleanliness in the bedchamber was a result of genuine ignorance or a kind of cultural acceptance. Historians still argue whether they simply didn't know about the link between filth and disease, or if the lack of proper cleaning was a practical reality born from the limitations of the era. The sheer logistics of heating enough water to wash the linens for a palace of thousands, and the lack of proper cleaning tools would have made a daily cleaning a monumental task. It was likely a mix of both. The cultural tolerance for filth, combined with the logistical challenges, meant that the royal bedchamber was always a little bit dirty. The consequences of this were not just a matter of a slightly grimy bed. The bedchamber was a perfect environment for the spread of disease. The vermin, carrying pathogens from one person to the next, were a constant threat. The unwashed linens, a breeding ground for bacteria, could easily lead to skin infections and other illnesses. The royal person, already weakened by a poor diet and a lack of proper hygiene, was constantly being exposed to a host of new pathogens in their own bed. The bedchamber, a place of supposed rest and recovery, was in reality a source of constant illness and discomfort. The lack of sanitation in the bedchamber also extended to other aspects of royal life. The birthing chamber, for example, was often a source of immense danger for both the mother and the child. The lack of clean linens, the unwashed hands of the midwives and physicians, and the unsanitary conditions of the room meant that infections were a constant threat. Child mortality was incredibly high, even for royals, and the lack of sanitation in the birthing chamber was a major contributing factor. The royal child, a symbol of the future of the dynasty, was in reality just as likely to die from a simple infection as a commoner. The royal bed, a symbol of power and fertility, was in reality a source of filth and disease. The beautiful, sparkling image of the royal court is now completely recontextualized by the knowledge that the most intimate and private of spaces were also the most filthy and unsanitary. The royal bedchamber, a place of supposed luxury and comfort, was in reality a hotbed of disease and contagion, and the king's greatest enemy was not a political rival, but a tiny invisible flea. It's a powerful reminder that history is often a story of hidden dangers, where the most beautiful and powerful things are also the most fragile. The lack of proper cleaning in the bedchamber was not just a matter of personal comfort, it was a matter of life and death, and it's a powerful reminder of how far we've come in the simple, but profound act of keeping ourselves and our world clean. And so, you're left to contemplate this final, powerful image. The king, a man who commands nations, lying in his bed, a place of immense power and wealth, but also a place of immense filth and discomfort. The royal bedchamber, a symbol of immense power and wealth, is in reality a source of filth and disease, a constant reminder that even the most powerful people in history were not immune to the simple, disgusting realities of their time. The bed was a source of rest and relaxation, but it was also a source of filth and disease, a constant reminder that the most intimate and private of spaces were also the most unhygienic. It's a sobering thought that the very act of trying to rest was a dangerous gamble with their health. Let's now move from the royal bed to the royal operating table, a place where a lack of hygiene had fatal consequences. The mainstream historical fact is that surgical procedures were performed with unsterilised tools, and the lack of understanding about germs meant that a simple operation could easily become a death sentence. You might imagine a skilled surgeon in a pristine environment, but the reality was a brutal, bloody and deeply unsanitary affair. Imagine you are a royal surgeon, a man of learning and prestige, tasked with lancing a painful boil on the king's leg. Your tools, a collection of knives and lancets, have been used on countless other patients, and they are simply wiped clean with a rag or a piece of cloth. There's no sterilisation, no boiling water, no alcohol. You cut into the king's skin, and the pus and blood flow freely. You've just introduced a host of new pathogens into the wound, and the king's already weakened body is now fighting a new infection. The royal body, a symbol of power and divine right, is in reality a fragile, vulnerable creature, constantly under attack from a host of invisible enemies. This brings us to a quirky or fringe tidbit. It is said that some surgeons, in an attempt to stop the bleeding from a wound, would use a hot iron to cauterize the skin, a brutal and incredibly painful process that did little to prevent infection and often caused more damage. The smell of burning flesh and the screams of the patient would have been a common part of the surgical experience. It's a powerful and gruesome image of a kind of medical practice that was more about brute force than about healing. For a light joke, you could say their surgical procedures were less a healing art and more a hot iron hobby. The scholarly debate still open for discussion is whether the royal surgeons' unsanitary practices were a result of genuine ignorance or a kind of calculated performance. Historians still argue whether they simply didn't know about the existence of germs, or if the ritual of their elaborate but unhygienic procedures was a way of reinforcing their power and mystique. The fact is, the medical community of the time was deeply resistant to new ideas, and the ancient theories of Hippocrates and Galen were still the dominant paradigm. The idea of tiny invisible creatures causing disease was seen as a kind of madness. The consequences of this were dire. A simple procedure, like a tooth extraction or the lancing of a boil, could easily lead to a life-threatening infection, a fever, and a quick, painful death. The royal body, already weakened by a lack of hygiene and a poor diet, was constantly being exposed to a host of new pathogens. The royal physician, with his limited knowledge and even more limited tools, would often attribute these illnesses to a bad humour or a weak constitution, never making the connection between the unsanitary procedure and the royal's pain. The royal physician's understanding of anatomy was also limited. They often relied on ancient texts and a few dissections of criminals, and their knowledge of the human body was, to put it mildly, incomplete. The surgical procedures were often a kind of blind guesswork, and the royal body, a symbol of power and divine right, was in reality just as likely to be a victim of a botched surgery as a commoner. The royal surgeon, a man of prestige and learning, was in reality just as likely to be a cause of death as a political rival. The lack of sanitation in the surgical chamber also extended to other aspects of royal life. The birthing chamber, for example, was often a source of immense danger for both the mother and the child. The lack of clean linens, the unwashed hands of the midwives and physicians, and the unsanitary conditions of the room meant that infections were a constant threat. Child mortality was incredibly high, even for royals, and the lack of sanitation in the birthing chamber was a major contributing factor. The royal child, a symbol of the future of the dynasty, was in reality just as likely to die from a simple infection as a commoner. And so, you're left to contemplate this final, powerful image. The king, a man of immense power, lying on a table, a simple procedure being performed on his body. The royal surgeon, a man of learning and prestige, stands over him. His unwashed hands and unsterilized tools a greater threat than any political rival. The royal court, a symbol of wealth and power, is in reality a hotbed of disease and contagion, and the king's greatest enemy is not another monarch, but a tiny, invisible germ. It's a powerful reminder that history is often a story of hidden dangers, where the most beautiful and powerful things are also the most fragile. The lack of proper medical sanitation was not just a matter of personal comfort, it was a matter of life and death, and it's a powerful reminder of how far we've come in the simple but profound act of keeping ourselves and our world clean. After the grisly scene of the royal operating table, let's explore a more bizarre and mystical side of royal hygiene and health. The mainstream historical fact is that superstitions dictated strange and often unhygienic health rituals, with royals and their courtiers often turning to folk remedies and magical cures rather than a physician. In a world where medical science was in its infancy, the line between medicine and magic was blurry at best, and the results were often gross and ineffective. Imagine a king suffering from a fever or a terrible stomachache, forgoing the advice of his physician and instead turning to an ancient ritual. He might be instructed to wear a poultice of herbs, animal dung, and various other unappealing substances on his skin. This concoction, far from being a cure, would likely cause a terrible rash or a skin infection. The belief was that the poultice would draw the illness out of the body, but in reality it was just a source of filth and a new form of discomfort. The royal body, a symbol of power and divine right, was in reality just as likely to be a victim of a folk remedy as a commoner. This brings us to a quirky or fringe tidbit. It is said that some royals would believe that they could cure their ailments by sleeping with a live animal. A common practice was to sleep with a cat or a small dog in the belief that the animal would draw the illness out of the body. The animal, of course, was unwashed and likely infested with fleas and other parasites, and it would do nothing to cure the illness, but it would certainly introduce a host of new hygiene problems. It's a powerful and slightly humorous image. A king, a man who commanded nations, sleeping with a cat to cure his fever, a kind of hope-based medicine that did nothing but increase the filth in the royal bedchamber. For a light joke, you could say their health plan was less about curing and more about cuddling. The scholarly debate still open for discussion is whether these superstitions were a result of genuine belief or a kind of desperation born from the failures of traditional medicine. Historians still argue whether they truly believed that these rituals would cure them, or if the lack of effective medical treatment simply forced them to turn to any available remedy, no matter how bizarre or unhygienic. The fact is, the medical community of the time was deeply resistant to new ideas, and the ancient theories of Hippocrates and Galen were still the dominant paradigm. The lack of effective cures for even simple illnesses meant that the royals, like their subjects, were often forced to turn to folk remedies and superstitions in a desperate attempt to heal themselves. The consequences of this were dire. The folk remedies, often made from unhygienic and toxic ingredients, could easily cause new illnesses or make the existing ones worse. The lack of proper sanitation in the rituals meant that the royals were constantly being exposed to a host of new pathogens. The royal body, already weakened by a lack of hygiene and a poor diet, was constantly being attacked by a host of new germs from the very remedies that were meant to heal it. The royal physician, with his limited knowledge and even more limited tools, would often attribute these illnesses to a bad humour or a weak constitution, never making the connection between the unsanitary rituals and the royals' pain. The use of these superstitions also had a social and political component. The king's body was a public body, and his health was a matter of national importance. The rituals and remedies he used were often a part of a grand performance, a public display of his belief in a cure, even if it was a bizarre and unhygienic one. The lack of privacy meant that the most intimate and personal of health issues were a matter of public record and intense scrutiny. The king's body was a kind of open book, and every ailment, every remedy, and every result was a matter of public record and intense scrutiny. And so, you're left to contemplate this final, powerful image. The king, a man of immense power, lying in his bed, a poultice of animal dung and herbs on his skin, a cat sleeping at his feet. The royal court, a symbol of wealth and power, is in reality a hotbed of superstition and bizarre rituals, and the king's greatest enemy is not another monarch, but the very remedies he is using to heal himself. It's a powerful reminder that history is often a story of hidden dangers, where the most beautiful and powerful things are also the most fragile. The lack of proper medical science was not just a matter of personal comfort, it was a matter of life and death, and it's a powerful reminder of how far we've come in the simple but profound act of keeping ourselves and our world clean. The royal body, a source of power and authority, was also a source of filth and disease, a constant reminder that even the most powerful people in history were not immune to the simple, disgusting realities of their time. The superstitious rituals, a symbol of hope and a desperate attempt to heal, were in reality a source of filth and disease, and it's a powerful and humbling reminder of the deep ignorance of the era. As we conclude our journey through the disgusting realities of royal life, let's turn our attention to the final act of personal hygiene, grooming. The mainstream historical fact is that personal grooming often involved painful and bizarre methods, a far cry from the gentle and clean routines we know today. In a world without modern tools or a proper understanding of skincare, the pursuit of a flawless appearance was a painful and often bloody affair. Imagine a queen, a woman of immense power and prestige, sitting in front of a mirror, her face a mask of determination. Her attendants are preparing a variety of tools, including sharp knives, tweezers, and a variety of harsh substances. Her eyebrows are being plucked with a pair of rough, unsterilized tweezers, a painful and often bloody process. The hairs on her face are being removed with a mixture of arsenic and lye, a highly toxic and corrosive concoction that would leave her skin red and inflamed. The belief was that the lye would burn the hair from the skin, but in reality it was a source of immense pain and a new form of skin damage. The royal body, a symbol of power and divine right, was in reality just as likely to be a victim of a painful beauty ritual as a commoner. This brings us to a quirky or fringe tidbit. It is said that some royals would believe that they could cure blemishes and other skin problems by using a poultice of crocodile dung and honey. The mixture, a disgusting and unhygienic concoction, would be applied to the skin in the belief that it would draw the impurities out of the body. The dung, of course, was a source of bacteria and other pathogens, and it would do nothing to cure the blemish, but it would certainly introduce a host of new hygiene problems. It's a powerful and grotesque image. A queen, a woman who commanded nations with a poultice of crocodile dung on her face, a kind of hope-based beauty routine that did nothing but increase the filth on her skin. For a final light joke, you could say their beauty regimen was less a spa day and more a dung day. The scholarly debate still open for discussion is whether these bizarre beauty rituals were a result of genuine belief or a kind of desperation born from a lack of effective alternatives. Historians still argue whether they truly believed that these rituals would make them more beautiful, or if the lack of modern tools and a proper understanding of skincare simply forced them to turn to any available remedy, no matter how bizarre or unhygienic. The fact is, the medical community of the time was deeply resistant to new ideas, and the ancient theories of beauty and health were still the dominant paradigm. The lack of effective cures for even simple skin problems meant that the royals, like their subjects, were often forced to turn to folk remedies and superstitions in a desperate attempt to heal themselves. The consequences of this were dire. The beauty rituals, often made from unhygienic and toxic ingredients, could easily cause new illnesses or make the existing ones worse. The lack of proper sanitation in the rituals meant that the royals were constantly being exposed to a host of new pathogens. The royal body, already weakened by a lack of hygiene and a poor diet, was constantly being attacked by a host of new germs from the very remedies that were meant to heal it. The royal physician, with his limited knowledge and even more limited tools, would often attribute these illnesses to a bad humour or a weak constitution, never making the connection between the unsanitary rituals and the royals' pain. The use of these grooming rituals also had a social and political component. The king's body was a public body, and his appearance was a matter of national importance. The rituals and remedies he used were often a part of a grand performance, a public display of his belief in a cure, even if it was a bizarre and unhygienic one. The lack of privacy meant that the most intimate and personal of health issues were a matter of public record and intense scrutiny. The king's body was a kind of open book, and every ailment, every remedy, and every result was a matter of public record and intense scrutiny. And so, we're left to contemplate this final, powerful image. The king, a man of immense power, a poultice of crocodile dung on his face, his skin red and inflamed from a toxic beauty ritual. The royal court, a symbol of wealth and power, is in reality a hotbed of superstition and bizarre rituals, and the king's greatest enemy is not another monarch, but the very remedies he is using to heal himself. It's a powerful reminder that history is often a story of hidden dangers, where the most beautiful and powerful things are also the most fragile. The lack of proper medical science was not just a matter of personal comfort, it was a matter of life and death, and it's a powerful reminder of how far we've come in the simple but profound act of keeping ourselves and our world clean. The royal body, a source of power and authority, was also a source of filth and disease, a constant reminder that even the most powerful people in history were not immune to the simple, disgusting realities of their time. The sun is setting on our journey now, casting long, peaceful shadows. The stories of filth and struggle are fading into the gentle hum of the night. It's a different world from the one we imagined, filled with a kind of quiet strength and a perseverance that we can only marvel at. You're back in your clean, comfortable bed, the air fresh and cool, and the world is a little bit more understandable now, a little bit more real. The kings and queens of the past, with their strange and often disgusting habits, were in their own way just trying to make it through the day, doing the best they could with the knowledge they had. The grand palaces and the beautiful clothes were just a thin veneer over a very human struggle against filth and disease. Now, let the stories of the past drift away on the soft wind. Close your eyes and let the quiet of the night wash over you. Sweet dreams.